It felt like everything around me was the same, but inside something was screaming. It wasn't anxiety, it was a calling, a feeling that the old me was being left behind. That moment doesn't arrive with chaos. It arrives quietly, almost politely. Life keeps moving as usual, but you don't move the same way inside it anymore. You go through the motions, yet something deeper is paying attention now. Not searching, not panicking, just noticing that what once felt enough no longer does. This video only appears when you've already begun to question reality, when the material world is no longer enough. So why is this happening to you now? Awakening rarely starts with answers. It starts with discomfort that doesn't feel wrong, just unfamiliar. A sense that the old explanations are wearing thin, that the life you built still works, but doesn't fully speak to you anymore. And once that noticing begins, it doesn't turn off. Nothing here is random. Not this moment. Not this pause. Not you being here right now. The real question isn't what you're about to find. It's what inside you has already begun to remember. At some point in life, usually quietly, a belief settles in so deeply that we stop questioning it. The belief that you are only this body, this name, this story you repeat when someone asks who you are. A collection of memories, habits, fears and preferences, walking around inside a fragile biological shell. It feels obvious, almost childish, to doubt it. Of course this is me. I can see my hands, I hear my thoughts. What else could there be? But this belief wasn't discovered. It was taught, repeated, reinforced so early and so often that it began to feel like common sense. From the moment you learned to speak, you learned to point to yourself. You learn to defend yourself, you learn to improve yourself, protect yourself, compare yourself. Slowly, an invisible boundary was drawn around you, and everything outside it became the world. Everything inside became me. And yet if you slow down enough to notice, cracks start to appear. You can observe your thoughts. If you can observe them, how can they be you? A thought comes, stays for a moment, then leaves. Another replaces it. Sometimes they contradict each other. Sometimes they surprise you. If you were truly your mind, you would be identical to every thought that passes through it. But you're not. There is something in you that notices the thinking without being consumed by it. The same happens with the body. Sensations rise and fall. Pain appears, disappears. Energy changes throughout the day. The body you have today is not the same body you had 10 years ago. Cells replace themselves. Structures changed, and yet something feels continuous. Something has been here through all of it, watching the changes instead of becoming them. This is where the illusion becomes most sophisticated. Not crude, not obvious, but elegant. It doesn't say, you are only flesh. It says, you are this experience. It blends awareness with its content so seamlessly that you stop noticing the difference, like a person who thinks they are the movie instead of the screen it's playing on. Modern life strengthens this illusion constantly. Everything asks for your identity, your job title, your productivity, your opinions, your past, your future plans. Rarely does anything ask you to notice the one who is aware of all of that. So attention collapses inward, contracts around roles and narratives, and what you actually are gets buried under layers of description. Science, interestingly, doesn't fully support this narrow definition of self. At the most fundamental level, your body is not solid in the way it feels. It's activity, movement, exchange. You are not a closed system walking through an external universe. You are an open process, breathing it in, eating it, reacting to it, influencing it, being influenced by it every second. There is no clear line where you end and everything else begins. The border is practical, not absolute. Even your mind doesn't operate in isolation. Your mood shifts with light, with sound, with other people's presence. Your thoughts change after a conversation, after silence, after loss, after wonder. If you were truly just a self-contained unit, this level of permeability wouldn't make sense. The illusion persists because it's useful. It helps you navigate, survive, make decisions. But usefulness is not the same as truth. A map helps you travel. but confusing the map for the territory limits where you can go. When the identity of this body and this mind becomes unquestionable, growth turns into management. You try to optimize the character instead of realizing you're not limited to it. This is often where discomfort begins. Not dramatic at first, just a subtle sense that something doesn't fit anymore. Achievements don't land the way they used to. Distractions feel thinner. You might catch yourself thinking, is this really it? Not as a complaint, but as a genuine question. The old definitions start to feel tight, like clothes that once fit perfectly. The reflex is usually to double down, to fix the body, improve the mind, add more goals, more information, more stimulation. But that only polishes the illusion. It doesn't question it. And the quiet tension remains because what's asking to be seen isn't broken. It's simply larger than the frame you've been using. There is a different way of noticing yourself that doesn't require belief or philosophy. It starts with something simple, paying attention to the sense of being aware itself. Not what you're aware of, but the fact that awareness is present at all. This presence doesn't age. It doesn't rush. It isn't impressed or threatened in the same way your thoughts are. It's been there during joy, boredom, fear, and calm, unchanged by their content. Once this is noticed, even briefly, the illusion loses some of its grip. You don't disappear as a person. You still have a body, a mind, a life, but they begin to feel more like instruments than identity, like something you inhabit rather than something you are trapped inside. And that shift changes the questions you ask. Instead of, how do I fix myself, something deeper starts to form. A curiosity about what this awareness is, how it relates to everything else, and why it feels less separate than you were taught. That curiosity doesn't come from the mind trying to improve itself. It comes from a wider field beginning to recognize itself. Once that recognition starts, even faintly, it naturally draws attention to something science has been quietly pointing toward for decades. That reality itself is not as solid, separate, or observer-independent as we once assumed. And if that's true out there, it raises an unavoidable question about what's happening in here. At first, this idea can sound abstract, even distant. Everything is energy. You've heard it before. It shows up in documentaries, articles, casual conversations. And because it's repeated so often, it risks becoming just another phrase that passes through the mind without landing anywhere real. But physics didn't arrive at this conclusion to sound poetic. It arrived there because matter, when examined closely enough, refused to behave like matter at all. What you touch, what you see, what feels solid and fixed, is mostly empty space in motion. Atoms are not tiny billiard balls stacked together. They are patterns of activity, probabilities dancing around a center that is never quite still. At the deepest level we can measure, there are no rigid objects, only events, interactions, fluctuations. The universe isn't made of things, it's made of relationships. Your body is not an exception to this. It is not a stable object moving through a stable world. It is a dynamic field, constantly exchanging information and energy with everything around it. Every breath pulls the outside in. Every exhale releases the inside out. Heat leaves your skin. Light enters your eyes. Sound moves your nervous system. Even the boundaries of your body are negotiations, not walls. This means you are not a closed unit reacting to an external universe. You are part of an ongoing conversation with it. Physics noticed something else that unsettled the old picture even more. At the quantum level, observation matters. The act of measuring changes what is measured. This doesn't mean your thoughts magically control reality in a simplistic way. It means that the observer is not separate from the observed. The system includes both. Reality responds to interaction, not passive viewing. That alone should make you pause. Because your entire life, you were trained to believe you are a spectator inside your head, watching a world that exists independently of you. But the deeper science goes, the harder it becomes to defend that separation. You are not standing outside reality, looking in. You are woven into it, influencing and being influenced at levels far below conscious awareness. Your nervous system is a receiver and a transmitter. It reads subtle cues constantly: tone, posture, rhythm, timing. Before words are understood, energy is felt. You've experienced this without needing to name it. Walking into a room and sensing tension, meeting someone and feeling at ease without knowing why. Feeling drained after certain conversations and expanded after others. These aren't mystical talents, they're signs of a system tuned to resonance. When physics talks about vibration, it's not talking about something vague. Frequency describes how systems oscillate, how they move, how they interact. When two systems are compatible, they exchange energy smoothly. When they're not, there's friction. In human terms, we call that chemistry, discomfort, attraction, resistance. Different words, same underlying principle. Your internal state is not silent. It broadcasts hormones, neural activity, posture, breath, micro-expressions. Long before you speak, your body has already sent a signal. And long before you consciously decide how you feel, your system has already responded to what's around you. This is why you can't fake alignment for long. The field always speaks louder than the story. What's rarely acknowledged is how exhausting it is to live out of sync with your own frequency. When your actions contradict what your system knows, tension accumulates. You might not call it that. You might call it stress, confusion, lack of motivation, or a constant low-grade irritation. But underneath, it's incoherence, too many internal signals pulling in different directions. This is not a moral failure, it's a physical one, like static on a radio. The signal is there, but it's buried under noise. Most people try to solve this by adding more input, more information, more techniques, more stimulation. But from the perspective of physics, adding energy to an already noisy system doesn't create clarity. It creates heat. The system becomes agitated, not aligned, and agitation is often mistaken for progress. You can see this pattern everywhere. Minds filled with concepts, but disconnected from presence. Bodies constantly busy, but deeply tired. A culture that mistakes movement for direction. None of this happens because people are unaware. It happens because they've never been shown how to reduce noise instead of amplifying it. The idea that you are a vibrational field in constant exchange with the universe is not meant to inflate you. It's meant to ground you. If this is true, then awareness becomes practical. Attention becomes a form of tuning. Small adjustments matter. What you expose yourself to matters. What you repeat internally matters. Not because the universe is judging you, but because systems respond to patterns. And this is where things begin to get uncomfortable for the mind that wants control. Because if you are part of a larger field, then forcing outcomes through sheer effort has limits. Pushing harder doesn't always work. Sometimes it creates more resistance. Sometimes the system needs less interference, not more. This is the point many people miss. They hear that everything is energy and immediately try to manipulate it. They visualize harder. They affirm louder. They chase higher states. But energy doesn't respond well to force. It responds to coherence. And coherence doesn't come from adding layers. It comes from subtraction. When physics studies systems that suddenly reorganize themselves, it often finds a moment of stillness before the shift. A pause, a reduction of competing signals. Only then does a new pattern emerge naturally, not imposed but revealed. Which brings up an uncomfortable question to sit with. If you are already immersed in this constant exchange, if your field is always communicating, what happens when you never stop to listen? What happens when noise becomes the default and silence feels threatening? That question doesn't ask for a quick answer. It asks for space. There is a mistake so common in spiritual growth that it rarely gets questioned because it looks exactly like dedication. It looks like effort. It looks like someone who truly wants to change, and because it looks sincere, it often goes unnoticed for years. The mistake is this: trying to evolve by adding more instead of learning how to stop. Elon, practices, books, teachings, retreats, techniques. The search becomes busy. The calendar fills. The mind collects concepts the way it once collected achievements, and on the surface, it feels right. You're not asleep anymore. You're doing the work. You're moving forward. At least that's how it seems. But quietly, something essential gets lost. Most people begin this path because they feel a gap, a sense that life, as it's being lived, is slightly off. Something meaningful is missing, even if everything appears fine from the outside. That gap creates discomfort, and the mind responds the only way it knows how, by trying to fix it. So spiritual growth becomes another problem-solving project. The irony is subtle. You start seeking depth, but you do it through accumulation. You add ideas on top of ideas, explanations on top of explanations. You learn new language, new frameworks, new ways of understanding reality, and the mind feels productive, even proud. It finally has something elevated to focus on. Yet the original restlessness doesn't fully dissolve. It just becomes more sophisticated. The problem isn't curiosity or learning. The problem is the direction of attention. Instead of turning inward to listen, attention keeps moving outward, even if the outward now looks spiritual. The noise changes its accent, but it doesn't stop being noise. Many people don't realize that silence is not the absence of activity. It's the absence of interference. And interference doesn't only come from distractions or chaos. It also comes from constant interpretation, constant labeling, constant trying to understand what's happening instead of noticing what is. There's a reason why moments of real clarity often arrive unexpectedly. In the shower, during a walk, in grief, in exhaustion, in stillness you didn't plan. They don't arrive because you finally thought the right thought. They arrive because, for a moment, the mental grip loosened. The mind is a powerful tool, but it was never designed to lead this kind of transformation. It was designed to navigate, predict, and protect. When it takes control of spiritual growth, it does what it always does. It seeks certainty, progress, and control. And inner evolution doesn't respond to any of those. This is why so many people feel strangely tense, even after years of practice. They meditate, but they're monitoring themselves. They reflect, but they're judging their reflections. They try to be present, but they're checking if they're doing it correctly. The system never rests. It just changes costumes. Another layer of this silent mistake is comparison. Not always with others, but with an imagined version of yourself. Who you think you should be by now. How calm you should feel. How awakened you should sound. This creates a constant inner measurement, and measurement keeps the observer active. Where there is constant measurement, there is no surrender. What's rarely said is that real transformation often feels like regression before it feels like growth. When the noise begins to fade, unresolved things surface. Old emotions, old questions, a sense of not knowing who you are without all the effort. This can feel disorienting, even lonely. And many people interpret that discomfort as failure, when it's actually the signal that something deeper is unfolding. So they go back to seeking, back to doing, back to filling the space. But the space is the point. The part of you that is capable of real change doesn't speak loudly. It doesn't compete for attention. It doesn't argue, it waits. And as long as the mind is constantly occupied with improvement, that quieter intelligence remains in the background, felt only as a vague pull or a subtle dissatisfaction. This is why silence feels uncomfortable at first, not peaceful but exposed. Without constant input, you start to notice how restless the system is, how quickly the mind reaches for something to hold on to, how unfamiliar it feels to simply be without becoming something. The mistake is assuming that this discomfort means something is wrong. In reality, it often means the process is finally honest. When you stop adding, you start seeing. When you stop chasing insight, insight starts to emerge, not as fireworks but as simple, grounded clarity. You begin to notice what drains you and what steadies you, what feels aligned and what feels forced. These aren't philosophical conclusions, they're bodily recognitions. And once that sensitivity returns, it changes how you relate to people and environments. You may find yourself less tolerant of certain dynamics, not out of judgment, but because your system feels the cost more clearly. Places that once felt normal begin to feel heavy. Conversations that once flowed start to feel misaligned. This is often misunderstood as withdrawal or isolation. But it's not about pulling away from life. It's about no longer overriding your own signals. The silent mistake was never a lack of effort. It was listening to the wrong kind of guidance. And as that shifts, as attention becomes quieter and more honest, another experience begins to appear. a sense of distance from what once felt familiar. Not dramatic, not sudden, but noticeable enough to raise a new question about connection, belonging, and why certain people and environments no longer feel the same. There comes a phase that almost no one prepares you for. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't look like a crisis in the traditional sense. From the outside, your life may appear unchanged. Same routines, same places, same faces. And yet, something feels off. Conversations don't land the way they used to. Environments that once felt familiar now feel strangely distant. You show up, but a part of you doesn't fully arrive. The immediate label most people give this feeling is loneliness. And because loneliness is something to be fixed, the instinct is to resist it, to fill the gap, to socialize more, talk more, distract more. But what if that interpretation is incomplete? What if this sense of disconnection isn't a lack, but a shift? When your internal state changes, your points of resonance change with it. Human connection is not only built on shared history or proximity, it's built on frequency, on unspoken alignment, on the subtle sense of being met. When that alignment begins to reorganize inside you, the external world doesn't always adjust at the same pace. This can feel deeply unsettling because belonging has always been tied to survival. To be part of a group meant safety, meaning, identity. So when that sense loosens, the nervous system reacts. It looks for something to blame. It wonders what went wrong. Did I change too much? Did I do something wrong? Should I try harder to fit back in? But often, nothing went wrong. Something moved. During transition, you're no longer fully who you were, but not yet settled into what's emerging. And that in-between state has a unique texture. It feels empty, but not quiet. Detached, but not cold. You can be surrounded by people and still feel alone. Not because there's no love, but because the old language of connection no longer fits. This is especially confusing when the people around you haven't changed. They're kind, familiar, well-intentioned, yet interactions feel thinner. You notice yourself holding back, not out of arrogance or judgment, but because the energy it takes to explain yourself feels too high, or because explaining wouldn't really capture what's happening anyway, so you listen more, you speak less. And that silence can be misread by others and by yourself. The mind wants clarity, it wants a story. I'm drifting away. I don't belong anymore. I'm becoming isolated. But those stories assume a static self. They assume you're supposed to remain compatible with the same environments forever. They don't account for growth that happens beneath language. Think about how the body transitions between states. Dawn is not night, but it's not day either. The colors are unfamiliar. The shapes are softer. If you judge dawn by the standards of noon, you'd call it incomplete. But it's not incomplete. It's transitional. The same applies here. In this phase, your system becomes more sensitive. You pick up on dynamics you once ignored. Power plays, emotional labor, conversations driven by habit instead of presence. None of this is new, but your tolerance for it is lower. Not because you're better than anyone, but because you're less willing to override your own signals. This often leads to a quiet grief. Not dramatic, just a soft sadness for the ease that used to exist. For the version of you that could blend in without friction. For relationships that felt natural simply because you shared the same level of awareness at the time. That grief doesn't mean those connections were false. It means they belong to a different chapter. The danger here is forcing yourself to stay the same out of loyalty to the past, loyalty to people, to identities, to expectations. That kind of loyalty costs energy. And over time, it creates resentment, fatigue, or a sense of inner splitting. Part of you moves forward, while another part stays behind to keep the peace. Transition asks for something subtler, not cutting ties, not burning bridges, but allowing space, letting distance exist without immediately labeling it as loss, trusting that not all connections are meant to travel the entire journey with you, and that this doesn't diminish their value. There is also a temptation to rush this phase, to search for new people, new environments, new labels that make the discomfort go away. But replacement is not the same as alignment. If you skip the pause, you carry the old patterns into new settings, and the disconnection quietly repeats itself. This in-between state is where your system recalibrates. It's learning what feels honest now, what feels nourishing, what feels draining. That discernment doesn't come from thinking. It comes from noticing how your body responds before your mind explains it away. And as this sensitivity sharpens, something else often happens. You begin to realize that this transition wasn't chosen consciously. It was triggered by pressure, by loss, by conflict, by moments that hurt more than expected, as if life itself applied just enough force to crack the old structure open, which raises a deeper question, one that doesn't accuse or comfort, but invites reflection. If this disconnection is part of a transition, what initiated it? And why does growth so often arrive wrapped in discomfort before it reveals its direction? There is a moment many people misunderstand because it arrives wearing the wrong label. It shows up as heartbreak, burnout, grief, disappointment, or a quiet despair that doesn't have a clear cause, and almost immediately the mind frames it as failure, as punishment, as proof that something has gone wrong. But emotional pain is rarely the first message. It's the last. Long before pain appears, there are signals, subtle ones, a loss of enthusiasm, a sense of dragging yourself through days that once felt alive, a growing gap between what you do and what feels true. These signals are easy to ignore because they don't interrupt your life dramatically. You can still function, still perform, still keep up appearances. So most people do exactly that. They override the signals and keep going. The system tries again. Fatigue sets in, irritability, a constant low-grade tension in the body. Sleep becomes shallow, joy becomes conditional. These aren't random glitches, they're feedback, but because they don't force immediate change, they're often normalized. This is just life. Everyone feels this way. I'll rest later. The field is patient. Only when those signals are consistently ignored does pain intensify. Not out of cruelty, but necessity. Pain is harder to dismiss. It interrupts narratives. It demands attention. It breaks routines. It forces questions that comfort never would. This is why emotional pain often feels disproportionate to the event that triggers it. A breakup that hurts more than expected. A criticism that cuts unusually deep. A loss of meaning that doesn't match external circumstances. The mind looks for a logical explanation, but the intensity isn't about the event. It's about accumulation. It's about how long the system has been asking quietly, before it had to raise its voice. Pain is not the message, it's the volume. From a physiological perspective, this makes sense. When a system is under chronic misalignment, stress hormones stay elevated. The nervous system remains on alert. Over time, resilience drops. What once could be absorbed now overwhelms. The same stimulus creates a stronger reaction because the buffer is gone. Emotionally, this feels like fragility. Spiritually, it feels like collapse. But structurally, it's a reset mechanism. The mind resists this interpretation fiercely. It wants pain to be a mistake, because if pain has meaning, then ignoring it has consequences. It's easier to believe that suffering is random than to consider that it carries information. So people try to escape it. They distract. They numb. They reframe too quickly. They look for immediate relief instead of understanding. And relief can be found temporarily. But when pain is bypassed instead of listened to, it returns in a new form, often stronger, often more disruptive. This is why some patterns repeat until they can't be avoided anymore. The same relationship dynamic, the same career dissatisfaction, the same internal conflict showing up in different costumes. Life doesn't repeat lessons to punish. It repeats because the message hasn't been integrated. There is also a common spiritual misunderstanding here. The idea that awakening should feel peaceful, expansive, light. And when pain appears, people assume they've failed or regressed. But awareness doesn't anesthetize, it sensitizes. As numbness dissolves, feeling returns, and not everything that returns feels good. Pain often marks the moment when you can no longer lie to yourself without cost, when the gap between your inner truth and your outer life becomes too wide to ignore. It's the point where pretending takes more energy than changing. This doesn't mean pain should be glorified. It doesn't mean seeking it or enduring it unnecessarily. It means recognizing its function when it arrives. Pain narrows attention. It brings you back into the body. It strips away excess narratives and reveals what actually matters to your system now. If you listen closely, pain often carries very simple information. Something like, this is no longer sustainable. This direction is no longer aligned. This version of you has reached its limit. The mind wants complex answers, but the signal itself is usually direct. What makes this stage so disorienting is that pain dissolves old identities faster than new ones can form. You know what no longer works, but you don't yet know what will replace it. That gap feels unstable. The temptation is to rush into new meanings, new roles, new explanations to escape the uncertainty. But the uncertainty is not empty. It's active. It's reorganizing. As this reorganization happens, something subtle begins to shift in how you relate to the world. You may notice that even without saying much, people respond to you differently. Some lean in, some pull away. Reactions seem stronger, even when your behavior hasn't changed much. That's not coincidence. When pain strips away pretense, your internal state becomes more exposed, and long before words are spoken, that state is already communicating. Before you say a single word, something has already been communicated. Not consciously, not deliberately, but clearly enough that others respond to it, often without knowing why. You've seen this happen. Someone walks into a room and the atmosphere shifts. Another person speaks very little yet carries weight. Someone else explains themselves endlessly and still isn't felt. What's being exchanged in those moments isn't information, it's state. Your body, nervous system, and emotional coherence are constantly sending signals. Micro-expressions, muscle tension, breathing rhythm, eye focus, pace of movement, even silence has a tone. Long before language enters the picture, these signals are read instinctively by others. This is not a special ability. It's a survival mechanism wired into humans long before complex speech existed. So when people react to you differently than before, it's rarely about what you said. It's about what you're carrying. When emotional pain strips away old defenses, when pretense falls apart, your internal state becomes more exposed. You may feel quieter, less interested in performing, or more intense, more raw. Either way, the field around you changes, and people feel that change before they can explain it. This is why you can walk into familiar spaces and suddenly feel out of place without anything obvious happening. Conversations may stall, jokes don't land. Some people become uncomfortable, others become unusually drawn to you. Nothing dramatic occurred, yet something is clearly different. What's different is coherence. When someone is internally divided, trying to appear fine while feeling fractured, that split is sensed. It creates confusion in others. They may feel uneasy, guarded, or drained without knowing why. On the other hand, when someone is aligned with their internal state, even if that state includes uncertainty or pain, the signal is cleaner. There's less contradiction, and that clarity can feel grounding to some, threatening to others. This is where misunderstandings often arise. You might think people are judging you, or that you're doing something wrong, but often they're simply responding to a signal they don't know how to interpret. When your energy no longer matches the role they expect you to play, the system between you destabilizes. Some people need familiarity to feel safe. When your internal rhythm changes, it disrupts that safety. They may pull away, criticize, or try to bring you back to who you were. Not because they're unkind, but because your change unsettles their reference point. Others respond in the opposite way. They lean in. They open up unexpectedly. They sense permission to be more honest themselves. Again, not consciously, but coherence invites coherence. This can be disorienting because you may not feel particularly confident or evolved. You may feel vulnerable, unsure, or in flux. And yet, people react as if something strong is present. That's because strength is not always loud or polished. Sometimes it's simply the absence of internal resistance. The mind often tries to regain control here. It wonders how to manage impressions, how to be perceived correctly, how to avoid making others uncomfortable. But managing the field rarely works for long. The field reflects what's happening underneath, not what you intend to project. This is why trying to fix how others respond to you usually fails. The adjustment doesn't happen at the level of behavior. It happens at the level of inner honesty. When you stop forcing yourself into outdated roles, the signal stabilizes on its own. There's also a subtle grief in this phase, realizing that some connections were sustained more by energetic compatibility than by conscious choice. When that compatibility fades, the relationship feels thinner, even if affection remains. That doesn't mean it was fake. It means it was contextual. The danger is interpreting this as superiority or separation, thinking, "I've outgrown people." That narrative creates distance and reinforces ego. The truth is simpler and more humbling. You're just no longer vibrating at the same frequency in certain contexts. And frequency is not hierarchy, it's alignment. This awareness also brings responsibility. When your field becomes more noticeable, reactivity carries more weight. Suppressed anger leaks. Unprocessed grief transmits. You don't have to explain yourself, but you do have to be honest internally. Otherwise, the signal becomes distorted again. And this is where many people feel stuck. They sense that their presence matters more now, but they don't yet understand how to inhabit it without effort. They feel watched, even when no one is watching. Not because others are judging, but because the internal observer has sharpened. That observer notices when you're not aligned, when you say yes but mean no, when you speak from habit instead of truth. And each time that happens, the field tightens slightly, creating friction with the world around you. This friction isn't a problem to solve. It's information. It's pointing to a deeper shift already underway, a shift where you can no longer return to unconscious compatibility, where going back to how things were simply doesn't work. And once that threshold is crossed, another realization often follows, quietly but decisively, that there may be no way to reverse this sensitivity, no way to fully return to the old version of yourself, even if you tried. There is a moment that doesn't feel dramatic when it happens. No lightning, no sudden certainty, no clear announcement that something irreversible has taken place, and that's why most people miss it. They assume awakening is an event you can point to, a peak experience you remember clearly. But the real shift is quieter than that. It reveals itself only afterward, when you try to go back and realize you can't. You may have already noticed this in small ways. You try to care about things that once mattered deeply, and the effort feels hollow. You attempt to return to old motivations, old ambitions, old versions of yourself, and something inside resists, not loudly, just enough to make the attempt feel false, like putting on clothes that technically fit but no longer feel like yours. This is often mistaken for confusion or burnout, but it's neither. It's a structural change in perception. Once certain things are seen, they cannot be unseen, not because you've gained special knowledge, but because your relationship to experience has changed. You've noticed how your mind works. You've felt the cost of ignoring your internal signals. You've recognized patterns that once ran unconsciously. And awareness, once stable enough, doesn't fully reverse. This doesn't mean you're constantly conscious or calm. It means the background has shifted. Even when you distract yourself, a part of you knows you're distracting yourself. Even when you act out of habit, there's a quiet awareness of the habit. That witness doesn't dominate, but it doesn't disappear either. The point of no return isn't about becoming enlightened. It's about losing the ability to fully pretend. Before this shift, you could override discomfort with enough justification. You could tell yourself stories that worked well enough to keep moving. Afterward, those stories still appear, but they don't land the same way. They feel thin, temporary, like explanations that don't quite reach the center anymore. This is why going back feels impossible, even if life externally looks the same. You can still play the roles, still meet expectations, still function, but the internal buy-in is gone, and without that buy-in, effort becomes heavier, resistance builds faster, fatigue sets in sooner. There's also a subtle fear that comes with this realization, not panic, but unease. If I can't go back, where exactly am I going? The mind wants a map, a timeline, a promise of resolution. But this transition doesn't offer that. It removes false certainty before it offers a new orientation. This is where many people try to force an identity upgrade. They label themselves, they adopt a new role, a new philosophy, a new version of who they think they should be now. But that usually backfires. The same awareness that dissolved the old identity can see through the new one just as quickly. The shift that happened wasn't about who you are. It was about how tightly you cling to any definition at all. What makes this stage particularly disorienting is that nothing external confirms it. There's no certificate, no clear milestone. In fact, from the outside, it may look like stagnation. You might appear slower, less driven, less certain. Internally, though, something fundamental has changed. The automatic momentum that once carried you is gone, and without momentum, choice becomes unavoidable. You begin to notice how often your actions are driven by expectation rather than truth. How many decisions were made to maintain continuity, not alignment. Before, that tension was manageable. Now, it's not. The body reacts faster. The nervous system tightens sooner. The feedback loop is shorter. This is not a punishment, it's a refinement. When awareness reaches a certain threshold, life stops allowing prolonged self-betrayal without consequence. Not because you're being tested, but because your sensitivity has increased. What once felt tolerable now feels loud. What once felt normal now feels heavy. This is why people at this stage often feel like they're standing on unstable ground. The old supports don't hold, and the new ones haven't formed yet. There's a temptation to rush forward just to regain a sense of footing, but rushing tends to recreate the same structures with new language. The point of no return is less about movement and more about honesty. You can still choose paths that aren't aligned, but you'll feel the cost immediately. There's no more delayed feedback. The system responds in real time now, and that responsiveness extends beyond you. The world seems to answer faster. Situations escalate quickly when ignored. Patterns intensify when avoided. It can feel like life is pressing closer, not giving you as much room to drift. This is often interpreted as life becoming harder. But it's more accurate to say life has become more precise, less tolerance for incoherence, less patience for half-truths. At this point, resisting the shift doesn't stop it. It just creates friction, and friction over time becomes pressure. Pressure demands release, which is why ignoring this inner turning point rarely leads to peace. The question that begins to surface here is not dramatic, but persistent. If there is no going back, how do you move forward without forcing, without pretending, without abandoning yourself again? That question doesn't ask for an immediate answer. It asks for alignment, and life has a way of insisting on it when it's ignored. At first, resisting the inner calling doesn't feel dangerous, it feels reasonable, sensible even. You tell yourself it's not the right time, that responsibilities come first. That you'll deal with it later when things calm down, when life gives you more space. The calling doesn't seem urgent. It's subtle, easy to postpone. And for a while, postponing works. You keep going. You stay functional. You meet expectations. You follow the path that makes sense on paper. Nothing collapses immediately, so the mind uses that as evidence. See? You can ignore it. It wasn't that important. It was probably just a phase. But the calling doesn't disappear. It waits. It waits because it's not an impulse, it's not a mood, it's not a desire that fades once satisfied. It's an alignment signal. And alignment doesn't negotiate with convenience. It doesn't argue. It doesn't chase you. It simply remains present, quietly registering every time you move further away from it. When you resist it long enough, life begins to speak on its behalf. At first, it's subtle pressure, small obstacles, delays, a sense that things require more effort than they should. You push harder, assuming you're just tired or unfocused. But the more force you apply, the less fluid everything feels. Progress comes with friction. Success feels oddly empty. Rest doesn't restore you the way it used to. This is often misinterpreted as bad luck or stress, but it's feedback. When your actions repeatedly contradict your deeper direction, energy leaks, motivation drops, creativity thins out. You may still achieve things, but they cost more than they should. The system is compensating for misalignment. If that feedback is ignored, life escalates, not dramatically at first, just enough to interrupt your momentum. A relationship begins to strain. A role you once managed with ease starts to feel unbearable. Your body signals exhaustion more loudly. Emotional reactions become sharper, less predictable. Things that once rolled off, you now linger. This is not life turning against you. It's life reducing your ability to stay asleep. Resisting the inner calling requires constant self-override. You have to suppress signals, reinterpret discomfort, and maintain a narrative that keeps you moving in the same direction. That takes energy. Over time, the cost accumulates. And when the cost becomes too high, the system forces a pause. This is where people experience what they call breakdowns, burnout, crisis, loss of meaning. From the inside, it feels like things are falling apart. From a wider view, something is being dismantled that no longer fits. Life insists not because it's harsh, but because it's efficient. If gentle signals don't work, stronger ones are used, not to punish, but to reroute. Pain, loss, and disruption are not evidence that you failed to listen once. They are evidence that you listened for too long and didn't act. There's often anger at this stage. Why now? Why this way? Why can't things just stay stable? But stability built on misalignment is fragile. It holds until it doesn't, and when it breaks, it tends to do so in a way that leaves no option but honesty. The danger of resisting the calling isn't that something bad will happen. It's that life will keep narrowing your options until the only remaining choice is the one you've been avoiding. The more you delay, the fewer exits remain. Not because life is cruel, but because clarity increases pressure. This is why some people feel like life cornered them, like they were forced to change. In a sense they were, but only because they refused every quieter invitation before that. What's rarely acknowledged is that the calling doesn't demand dramatic action. It doesn't ask you to destroy your life or abandon everything. That's a fear the mind projects to justify resistance. In reality, the calling often asks for smaller, braver shifts. Truthful conversations, boundaries, letting go of roles that drain you, allowing yourself to admit what you already know. But when those small shifts are avoided, larger ones become necessary. The mind prefers control even if it's uncomfortable over uncertainty. It would rather manage known suffering than step into the unknown. So it clings to familiar structures long after they've stopped serving growth. Life responds by destabilizing those structures until clinging is no longer possible. There's a quiet intelligence in this process, a kind of insistence that doesn't shout, but also doesn't retreat. Once you've crossed a certain threshold of awareness, life stops allowing you to live far from yourself for long periods of time. The margin for self-betrayal shrinks, and when resistance finally breaks, when the old path becomes unsustainable, something unexpected often appears beneath the fear. Relief. Not because everything is solved, but because the internal fight ends. Energy returns, not as excitement, but as steadiness. That steadiness brings a new kind of attention. You start noticing the consequences of alignment and misalignment almost immediately. How your body responds, how situations unfold, how people react when you're honest versus when you're performing. At that point, the question is no longer whether life will insist. It already has. The question becomes how clearly you can read what it's been communicating all along, and whether you can learn to respond before pressure is the only language left. After everything that has shifted, many people secretly hope for one thing: peace that stays, calm that doesn't break, a life that finally feels resolved. It's an understandable hope, especially after so much internal friction. But what comes next is not a permanent state of ease. It's something more demanding and far more alive. What comes next is awareness that doesn't turn off. This can feel disappointing at first. Awareness sounds subtle, almost passive, but in practice, it's anything but. Constant awareness means you no longer disappear inside habits the way you used to. You don't fully lose yourself in distraction, justification, or denial. Even when you try, something remains present, watching quietly. Life still brings challenges. Emotions still rise. Fear still appears. Anger still visits. The difference is that these experiences no longer define the entire landscape. They move through awareness instead of becoming the whole of it, and that changes how long they stay. how deeply they entangle you, and how much damage they do. Peace, as most people imagine it, is a kind of numb harmony. Nothing disturbs it, nothing questions it. But awareness doesn't offer that. Awareness offers clarity, and clarity doesn't always feel comfortable. Sometimes it reveals how tired you are. Sometimes it exposes misalignment quickly, before you can smooth it over. Sometimes it shows you truths you would have preferred to postpone. This is why awakening doesn't feel like floating above life. It feels like being fully inside it, without anesthesia. You notice when you're lying to yourself, not dramatically but unmistakably. You notice when a yes costs too much, when a situation drains you even if it looks fine on the surface, when an old pattern tries to reclaim control. Awareness doesn't shame you for these moments. It simply doesn't let them hide. There's also less room for unconscious drama, not because you become emotionless, but because you see the mechanics of it sooner. You feel the surge before it becomes a reaction. You sense the story forming before it hardens into identity. Sometimes you still fall into it, but recovery is faster. The spiral is shorter. This can feel like losing something, the intensity of being fully absorbed, the relief of forgetting yourself. But what you gain is continuity, a sense of being present through all states, not just the pleasant ones. With constant awareness comes responsibility, not the heavy kind imposed from outside, but the internal kind that can't be outsourced anymore. You can't unknow what you know. You can't fully blame circumstances for choices that are clearly misaligned, and that can feel sobering. At the same time, it's liberating. Decisions become simpler, even when they're not easy. You stop negotiating with yourself endlessly. You feel when something is off, and that feeling matters more than external approval. The noise of other people's expectations loses some of its authority. Not because you don't care, but because you can feel the cost of betraying yourself too clearly now. This awareness also brings humility. You see how often the mind tries to reclaim control, how quickly it wants certainty, how seductive spiritual identity can be. Awakening doesn't make you superior, it makes you more transparent to yourself, and that transparency changes how you relate to meaning. You stop searching for constant highs or permanent answers. You begin to value presence over conclusions. You realize that understanding is not something you arrive at once, but something that deepens through attention. Small moments carry more weight. Ordinary experiences feel textured instead of flat. There's also a quieter kind of trust that develops. Not blind optimism, but a grounded sense that you can meet what arises. Awareness builds capacity. You become less afraid of uncertainty because you're no longer trying to control every outcome. You respond instead of react more often than not. Still, there are days when you miss the simplicity of unconsciousness. Days when you wish you could go back to not noticing so much. That wish doesn't mean anything went wrong. It means you're human. Awareness doesn't remove fatigue. It doesn't erase grief. It doesn't protect you from loss. What it does is keep you in relationship with reality as it is, rather than the version you wish it were. And that relationship, over time, becomes steadier than any temporary peace. Something else begins to emerge as well, slowly and without spectacle. A sense that you're not navigating this alone, even when you feel solitary. Patterns start to feel less random. Timing feels more precise. Connections appear at moments that matter, not always when you want them. It's subtle, easy to dismiss if you're looking for proof, but noticeable if you're paying attention. Awareness tunes you to signals you once missed, and as that tuning deepens, another realization starts to take shape. That what you thought was isolation might have been quiet guidance all along, waiting for the noise to drop low enough for you to hear it. At some point, usually after the noise has worn you down, something unexpected becomes clear. Not as an idea, not as a belief you adopt, but as a felt recognition. That the sense of being alone you carried for so long was never the truth. It was a side effect, a consequence of living inside too much mental movement, too many voices, too many interpretations layered on top of direct experience. Loneliness, in this light, reveals itself differently, not as the absence of connection, but as the inability to perceive it. For most of life, attention is pulled outward and upward at the same time. outward into roles, expectations, comparisons, upward into narratives, plans, worries, explanations. The system stays busy, scanning, predicting, adjusting. There's very little space left to notice what's quietly present underneath all that activity. And what's present doesn't announce itself. It doesn't interrupt. It doesn't compete. Guidance, connection, meaning, whatever name you give it, moves at a different pace. It shows up as timing rather than instruction, as a pause that prevents a mistake, as a chance encounter that shifts your direction slightly, as a sentence you hear at exactly the moment you needed it, even if you don't understand why until much later. When the mind is loud, these things feel random, coincidental, easy to dismiss. But as awareness stabilizes, patterns begin to stand out. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, in a grounded, almost ordinary way that makes you wonder how you missed it before. You start to notice that certain doors never opened, no matter how hard you pushed, and others opened with very little effort once you stopped forcing them. You notice that some losses, which once felt cruel, quietly removed you from paths that would have drained you completely. You notice that moments of stillness often arrive just before something important shifts. This isn't about believing in something external taking care of you. It's about recognizing a form of intelligence that operates through connection rather than control. You were never navigating life alone as a separate unit trying to survive a hostile world. You were embedded in a field of feedback the entire time. The problem was never the absence of signals. It was interference, constant mental noise drowning out subtle information. When the noise fades, even slightly, you begin to feel supported in a way that doesn't inflate the ego. It doesn't make you special. It makes you included, part of something responsive and alive, rather than isolated and random. This realization often brings emotion, not excitement, not relief exactly, more like a soft release, as if a long-held tension finally loosens. The tension of thinking you had to figure everything out on your own, that every wrong turn was solely your fault. That meaning was something you had to manufacture through effort. Instead, meaning reveals itself as something you align with, not something you create from scratch. You also begin to reinterpret your past. Moments that once felt like abandonment take on a different shape. Periods of solitude no longer look like punishment, but like recalibration. Times when everything fell apart start to look less like chaos and more like clearing. Not because the pain wasn't real, it was, but because the absence you felt wasn't emptiness. It was quiet presence, unnoticed, because you were trained to look for noise. This doesn't turn life into something predictable or safe. It doesn't guarantee outcomes. What it does is change your relationship to uncertainty. You stop experiencing uncertainty as abandonment. It becomes space. Space where something can move, adjust, emerge. You also stop demanding constant reassurance. Not because you no longer need support, but because you recognize it arrives in forms subtler than words. A sense of timing, a feeling of restraint, a sudden clarity that prevents an action that would have led nowhere. This kind of guidance doesn't override your choices, it responds to them. When you move in alignment, things tend to flow with less resistance. When you don't, friction increases, not as punishment, but as information. The idea that you were never alone doesn't make you passive. It makes you attentive. You begin to listen differently, not just to people, but to pauses, to hesitation, to the moments when something inside you tightens or relaxes without explanation. These signals were always there. You just couldn't hear them over the constant effort to become someone, achieve something, fix something. And perhaps the most humbling part of this realization is that nothing new was added, no special power was gained, no external authority appeared. What changed was subtraction. Noise fell away, and what remained had been present the entire time. That presence doesn't speak in sentences. It doesn't tell you what to do next in clear steps. It simply responds when you pay attention. And the more you notice it, the more you realize that guidance doesn't feel like being told. It feels like being met, which raises a quiet, unsettling thought. If connection was never missing, if guidance was never absent, then the real shift wasn't about finding something new. It was about learning how to listen without immediately filling the silence. If you made it this far, maybe you really are ready. But ready for what? Not for perfection, not for having life figured out. Ready to stop running from yourself, ready to stop searching everywhere else for something that has been quietly waiting inside you the whole time. This video didn't give you all the answers. That was never the point. What it offered was a question powerful enough to change the way you listen. What if everything you were looking for was already here, beneath the noise, beneath the effort, beneath the roles you learned to play? If that question stayed with you, then something has already shifted. You don't need to rush. You don't need to force clarity. Just notice what feels more honest now. That's where alignment begins. If you really watched until the end, write this sentence in the comments. I'm listening now. And if this resonated with you, choose one of the videos on the screen and keep going. Not to find answers, but to stay connected to this quieter, truer way of seeing.